Hello and welcome. My name is Shelby Cook, and I am a programmer and the editor-in-chief at Film East, a Norwich-based young film programmers group. Film East is an award-nominated film group that provides a platform for young audiences to experience cinema through immersive and interactive film screenings. Run by a group of young people for young people, Film East aims to inspire and educate the next generation of film enthusiasts by offering unique opportunities to connect through thought-provoking cinema. And one of the ways that we achieve this is via Film East Chats, the very thing you're listening to right now. It's a podcast-style roundtable discussion where we as a group talk about a film specially selected by one of our programmers. Usually lasting between 15 and 20 minutes, Film East Chats is broadcasted monthly on BBC Radio Norfolk, with discussions ranging from the use of mature themes in Disney's Lilo and Stitch, to the importance of food in Studio Ghibli animations, and even the Hugh Grant archetype, which was created in Four Weddings and a Funeral. To listen back to any of our episodes, you can visit film-east.com/film-east-chats or visit our YouTube channel. For this year's Young Norfolk Arts Festival, we recorded an exclusive podcast episode for festival goers that could engage audiences while being outside or just away from the computer. So that means no scrolling through social media while listening. This episode, our longest yet, explores the unconventional rock star biopic, uncovering how Dexter Fletcher's 2019 film Rocketman and Todd Haynes' cult classic Velvet Goldmine redefined the biography of LGBTQ musical icons Elton John and David Bowie. I am joined by my fellow programmers, Neve Brooke, Sarah Lapanova, Alex Smith, and Will Schofield for this discussion. Throughout the episode, you'll hear our programmers discuss how the films transport audiences by subverting their expectations for both the film and for the personas of the rock star themselves. If you haven't seen either film, we do recommend that you watch them before listening, as spoilers are ahead, but mostly we want you to watch them because they're just brilliant films. So without further ado, here's Film East chatting about Rocketman and Velvet Goldmine. Okay, so now let's dive into the discussion. Everyone take a very deep breath. We're very excited about this because these are films that we love.
I have my coffee table book nice and ready beside me, ready for facts.
Beautiful Rocketman coffee book.
I feel so jealous right now. It looks so cute.
So we'll start off with initial thoughts. Some of you guys, this is your first time seeing these films. For the case of me and Neve, big stands of both of these films. So go ahead with your initial thoughts.
Well, I'm going to be biased because I think everyone knows that Rocketman is like my jam. It's my favorite film ever. I've never had such a visceral reaction watching a film. And in the year it came out, I watched it 10 times. Yeah. I don't know, it encompasses everything I love about cinema, sort of playing with form, heartbreaking stories, telling interesting stories, costume design, bit camp, just everything. I think it's fantastic. I love Rocketman. So that's my thoughts on Rocketman.
Yeah, that was the initial reaction that I had first time I watched Rocketman too, because I was expecting it to be more of like Bohemian Rhapsody. I mean, to be honest, I still haven't seen Bohemian Rhapsody because I have no interest in seeing that.
I wouldn't.
Yeah, but I was expecting it to be more like that, so I didn't really have very high expectations for it. And then it just sort of completely blew me away when I saw it. I was like, this movie rocks.
Yeah, I feel absolutely the same. I absolutely love it. I think, what I love about it is how kind of spectacular and fantastical it is, and how it doesn't try to be really realistic. It really plays around with who Elton was and the kind of showman he was, and they really put that in the film. And it's just so theatrical and beautiful and so much fun.
Me and my partner earlier, we were actually comparing Rocketman and Bohemian Rhapsody, and I was saying I think Rocketman it is far better in my opinion, and I think it's a horror that it didn't get an Oscar or anything like that. But for me, it's just the gut feeling. Like, so at the start when he's playing the piano at the Troubadour and everyone starts floating, it's the feeling of just like awe and excitement I have, which just encapsulates my feelings about the film altogether. As they were lifting, I was like lifting out of my chair, like, oh my God, this is incredible.
Alex, literally that scene like brought little tears in my eyes when I first seen it. I was like, oh, so cute. Just magical.
It was, and I think that they were really trying to get that exact feeling.
For me, the films were both quite outside of my personal wheelhouse in terms of what I generally choose to watch. And I enjoyed them both massively. It's a funny coincidence that I watched Rocketman for the first time about 2 weeks ago, like before I even knew we were kind of planning on doing anything like this. And it just is, it's, as someone who knows very little about either Elton John and David Bowie and doesn't really listen to their music and stuff and doesn't really have much of a connection to those kind of
First of all,
periods that they're representing.
That is so rude. Okay.
I know that's sacrilege, and I was very worried about. That's the main thing I was worried about before coming on this Zoom call, is how I was going to get that.
We're all going to bully you. The fact that you don't listen to Elton John.
Understandably.
Will, you're kicked out.
But no, it's just like, as someone who kind of doesn't really have any investment in the topic particularly, they still both manage to be incredibly, Rocketman especially, just as you said, like very fun, very camp, just like quite emotionally resonant, just a really enjoyable watch, which I honestly, again, was not expecting, because like you said, I kind of associated it with Bohemian Rhapsody, which likewise I haven't seen, but I know a lot of people who are very passionate about it and very passionately dislike it for various reasons. But yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a perfect segue into our first, we're going to break this up into two sort of categories. So we're going to talk about the film's constructions themselves, and how they sort of subvert our understandings of the biopic, and particularly the rock star biopic. And then after that, we're going to talk about the rock stars themselves, so the sort of culture that revolves around the topics, the main subjects of these films. So we kind of already have talked about comparing Rocketman in particular to Bohemian Rhapsody. There's also what's quite interesting if we look at these films. So for anyone who hasn't seen the films, they're sort of told in these like magical realism ways. So I'll talk about Velvet Goldmine, and then if anyone wants to jump in and give sort of a background on Rocketman. But with Velvet Goldmine, so the sort of background of the story is it's about the youth subculture of glam rock in the early 1970s. And the main character is a rock star called Brian Slade, very heavily based off of David Bowie. We cannot say that it's David Bowie because David Bowie was going to sue the production if they used any of his actual biography in it. But when you watch it, it's very, if you know anything about David Bowie's history, it is very much David Bowie. So we're going to just say here that we're talking about David Bowie. And it's sort of a mixture of all these different rock stars and characters within the glam rock scene and the countercultural scene in Britain at that time. And so their influence on the average teen, the person. So the main story follows this music journalist who's played by Christian Bale. And he's tasked with looking back at Brian Slade 10 years after he sort of fell off the face of the earth. So he started failing in his music and no one was paying any attention to him, and then he just sort of disappeared. And the whole story is told through this sort of like Citizen Kane style of storytelling. So Arthur goes and talks to all the people who are associated with Brian Slade, because obviously no one has seen Brian Slade since for 10 years. And so the whole story is sort of told through this perspective of how other people see this figure and how they identify with this figure, rather than actually having the man himself, speak for who he is as a person. So it's told through this very non-linear storyline, and it's this very complex sort of way of detailing sort of the history of that era without actually using real biography. So all of the characters are fictional characters, but they're all based off people from that real era. So does anyone want to give a background of Rocketman, sort of a summary how Rocketman's laid out compared to other biopics.
I will, if anyone doesn't mind. So Rocketman is told through the sort of the lens of Elton. It is to him in sort of Alcohol Anonymous. He is literally, the first 5 minutes is him detailing everything he's addicted to. It's him after he's successful, and he's retelling his life in therapy. And the entire thing is told through Elton's lens. So it's fantastical. It's not always true. It's kind of insinuated that he's an unreliable narrator, as there's this sort of running gag that, you know, in 20 years, I've never had an argument with my best friend. And you see throughout the narrative them bickering like crazy and having massive arguments. And I think so you slowly find him disintegrating and succumbing to fame and addiction through the lens of musical numbers. And the music within the film is his real records that they have somewhat embedded into the narrative to create a really effective musical, even though the songs had nothing to do with those situations.
Yeah, it's sort of like a jukebox musical. So it's like
Yeah.
Mamma Mia in that sort of sense, where they took Elton's songs and sort of placed them into the narrative.
I saw this quote where Elton John said the "I Want Love" song at the beginning of this film, where his family, he comes from a really broken family, a very toxic family, and they all sat singing what they want and how they want love, and neither of them have it. And he said that was just a sort of, it didn't mean anything to me, that song, before. And watching his nan sing that made him weep like a child, and apparently he had to leave the screen because seeing his songs tell this part of his life was apparently really difficult for him. So I think, yeah, they did it really, really well.
And I think particularly with the songs, it's really interesting because he didn't write the lyrics.
Yeah.
You see that parallel of Bernie's the one that writes all the lyrics, and then Elton's the one that writes the music. So it's really interesting how well these lyrics fit into his sort of narrative of his life, even though they aren't clearly not about his life because he didn't write them.
Yeah.
So we kind of touched on this a little bit, comparing it to Bohemian Rhapsody. But for those of us who have seen it or know of Bohemian Rhapsody, what sort of do you think is the standout that makes these two films in particular so different from other traditional biopics? So if you look at Bohemian Rhapsody, it's very cut and dry history. You know, it is what it is. There's not much anything really interesting about it. Whereas how would these ones compare?
I think one thing that's quite interesting is kind of the involvement with the original artists and the people it's based on. I know that there was a lot of criticism levied at Bohemian Rhapsody because it had a large amount of involvement from the original members of Queen, except for Freddie Mercury, who of course passed away. And a lot of people felt that they used the film to kind of glorify themselves almost and make Freddie look like a little bit of a dickhead. And there was a lot of arguments about how accurate that was and how fair it was, and that's neither here nor there. But when you compare that to Rocketman, it's very clear that Elton is very open about the fact that a lot of the time he was a bit of an ass, then that he acted foolishly and selfishly, and was a very fractured kind of person, and that makes it a lot more easy to kind of invest with and accept as a kind of more realistic story. And I also think it's interesting that, like, when you look at how his friend Bernie Taupin, is that his name? Was kind of treated. He's treated in Rocketman as kind of an angelic figure. He's like handsome, he's chiseled, he's the nicest guy, he always gives the best advice, he always comes in with a babe under each arm. And I think that's like almost the complete polar opposite of how Bohemian Rhapsody treats its subject matter. Like, Elton's almost like, look, you can say what you want about me, I know I've been shitty, but you gotta give respect to my boy Bernie because he's my best mate.
Yeah, it is very interesting because it does feel like, I mean, you know that Elton John was very heavily involved in the production of this film, and like he had even written an extra song for it. And I remember when it came out, he was like on tour with like Taryn, and like they were like doing tours together. Like he was like so proud of this movie. And it's just interesting that you want to feel like it is a very authentic and real way of representing, but it also harks back to that idea of it's what Elton wants to project as himself. So are you really being able to see an outside perspective of how these situations unfold and how this person was in real life, compared to Velvet Goldmine, which is about David Bowie, and David Bowie is never even mentioned in the story.
I think that's a really good point, because what I think about Rocketman specifically, I think the storytelling is so clever, because Elton is a household name, he's really beloved, and so he provides this image of him, you know, it's really gorgeous, like gorgeously done, gorgeous cinematography, it's really rose tinted, it's a spectacle, using bright costumes and beautiful set design. And so it's all what the audience wants and what the audience expects. And he delivers that, and he keeps that magic of his performance alive. But if you strip all of that away and only leave the dialogue through the entire film is like heartbreakingly sad.
Yeah, particularly when he's in the scene towards the end of the movie, and he's in AA and he's confronting everyone who was mean to him in his life, like his family, and he's just like, I'm not gonna let you speak to me like that anymore. And I was like, oh my god. And then and that's something else I wanted to talk about. Neve, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
Yeah, I also think compared to Bohemian Rhapsody, Rocketman sort of especially, it's aware of its narrative. I found with Bohemian Rhapsody, it's called Bohemian Rhapsody, so you would assume it's about Queen, but they marketed it and made a film more about Freddie Mercury, but then drastically did not include his queer life. And he died of AIDS tragically, and it's kind of whispered in the narrative, and he's hardly shown with his long-term partner, he's shown more with a woman. Whereas Rocketman, Elton John is gay throughout the entire narrative, and there's gay sex scenes, you know, orgies. I don't know if I can say that, but there is. It's Elton. He's unapologetically him, and they didn't shy away from that. Whereas Bohemian Rhapsody was like, oh, I don't really know how to show that.
And that very much feeds into the, you know, conversation of marketability and how commercial you want to film, because obviously, like we said in the beginning, Rocketman did not get any of the recognition that Bohemian Rhapsody got. And even Bohemian Rhapsody, I think it was in China maybe, you know, they had removed one scene of them talking about Freddie Mercury being gay or something, or the movie wasn't allowed to be screened or something like that. And like, you know, Rocketman didn't get over there. And it's just, you know, you really admire that what is more important to them, it was telling the authenticity of that culture and of Elton as a queer icon, rather than being able to sell a movie that's, oh, it's a fun movie with Elton John's music, like, woo, yay.
I think the difference between Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocketman, and that shyness compared to flamboyantness, is really overtly obvious in the visuals as well. Because with like Bohemian Rhapsody, it is beautiful, but it's toned down, especially when you compare it to Rocketman, which is visually so flamboyant, and they aren't afraid of putting in effects like Elton rocketing off of a stage and people floating in the air, and these big massive dance numbers. And I think that can also tie into how they represent the lives of these main characters. So with Freddie, it kind of, like you said, it glosses over it. It doesn't go into the complications of it. But with Rocketman, these eccentric dance scenes can be a visual way of how they are communicating how complicated everything he was going through in his life was. The complicated dancing and settings and costumes translate to the emotional conflict and complications he was experiencing.
Yeah, and on a similar note, I really want to talk about the use of metaphor and imagery in both of these films. So in Rocketman, obviously the biggest like overarching metaphor that runs throughout the entire film is costuming. So we first see Elton when he goes into, at the beginning of the film, he goes into his AA meeting and he's all dressed up in this, you know, in an Elton John over the top outfit. And slowly throughout the narrative, as he's continuing to talk about his struggles and, you know, his problems that he has, the costume slowly starts to come off. So at first I think like the horns come off of the outfit, and then the wings, and then the hat, and then he's just in a tracky outfit. And I think that's a very beautiful metaphor for the stripping away of the glamour of the rock star. And that's very much what this film is about, is diving deep into who this person is rather than the spectacle that they are. And then there's also a great moment when he goes to AA for the first time. I think it's after he performs at Madison Square Garden, or he doesn't end up performing there. He goes to AA and he walks in the door, and all of like the gemstones of his costume start to come off and fall off and bounce all over the floor. And so that's finally the breaking point of him as a person. He can't keep playing the character of Elton John anymore because he knows that it's killing him. And he wants to be Reginald again because that's who he is as a person, and not projecting the sort of false identity anymore. And I think that's really where, in my opinion, Rocketman far exceeds any traditional biopic, because biopics typically don't have that sort of imagery and that sort of metaphor in it, where it's very cut and dry. You know, this is Freddie Mercury singing at Live Aid, you know, like, you know, that's just how it is. And it's nothing very spectacular about it. Whereas that, I think, really struck me this second time I watched it, was sort of the use of costuming, and costuming is so important to Elton too. Like, they make a really big deal at the end about him having a shopping addiction.
Yeah.
But like, clothes are really important to him as a person.
Sorry.
I was going to say there's a scene in the middle of the film after Elton has thrown himself into the pool, and it's kind of a flashback, and it flashes back to the very start of the film. And I was quite shocked, because up until that point I hadn't realized how gradually the film had been transitioning to a more colorful palette. And as soon as the flashback came up, I realized how drastically different those different parts of Elton's life were represented to be. Because when he was a child and wasn't hiding behind these costumes and the fame, it was dark and more gritty. But now that he was engulfed in the fame, it had become so much more complicated, and so many different color schemes clouding what was really happening.
I was just going to talk about the pool scene, weirdly, but a completely separate point. So it's weird that it resonated with us in two different ways. Going off what you said earlier, Shelby, about the costume, after the pool scene in which she tries to commit suicide, I feel like that scene for me kind of sums up Rocketman as a whole. And ironically, it's the Rocketman song. So I think but he is performing this Rocketman song with such emotion and getting his stomach pumped but it encapsulates the sort of toxic cycle he was going through, where he gets stripped naked, injected with things, forced into a costume. And there's this brilliant moment. And I think it's the moment that struck me when I was like, oh, Taron Egerton, you are talented. He is like depressed. He grabs a bat, smile goes on, he's on stage and he's Elton. And it was one of those moments where costume design, dance, performance had sort of melted into this beautiful cacophony. And it's just, every time I watch it, literally takes my breath away. And I think it's an amazing scene. And that's what I thought when you talk about costume, I was like, when he's thrust into a glittery baseball outfit, and it just feels so Elton.
Yeah, that was the scene too. The first time I watched it, I was like, whoa, this movie legit. Like, this is, because that is a very powerful imagery. And you know, that is really what happens with a lot of these pop stars or rock stars, or I think Katy Perry had a documentary made about her too. And there was the same thing where her husband, you know, said, I want a divorce. And she's backstage absolutely sobbing her heart out. And she just gets up, gets her costume on, goes on stage, puts a smile on, and she's Katy Perry. And so it's, you know, it's like that really, like, it gives me chills just thinking about it. Like, it's acting in a way, and it's performance, and it's part of being a performer, but it's also like, you know, these people's lives are like, this is who they are. I want to pivot to Velvet Goldmine and the imagery used in Velvet Goldmine because I love David Bowie. But in particular, so if we're talking about like metaphor and symbolism used in these two films, obviously one of the really big overarching metaphors and symbols in Velvet Goldmine is this emerald jewel that's never really explained, and it's just kind of this weird thing that keeps reoccurring. So at the very opening of the film, they show Oscar Wilde being, dropped off at someone's house, and that those are the people who are going to raise Oscar Wilde, and it's kind of alluded to the fact that he's an alien. It's just kind of crazy, it's like he just descended from the heavens, and he is brought down with this jewel. So this jewel makes reappearance throughout all of the characters. And then when we get into the 70s, so Oscar Wilde is used as this sort of defining character of queerness that we see. Obviously, Oscar Wilde was very outwardly queer in his writing, and a lot of his quotes are used by the characters throughout Brian Slade's journey. So he's sort of this being that's sort of overtaking this. So we see this jewel reoccur in the different characters. So when we get into the 70s, a sort of androgynous, I'm not sure if this character is meant to be trans, but they're very androgynous, named Jack Ferry, who's one of the glam rock singers, and he was the one that was very famous before Brian Slade came. He has the jewel, and then Brian Slade takes the jewel from Jack Ferry, so it's alluded that he steals it from him. Then the jewel gets passed to Kurt Wilde, who is sort of this very outrageous but quietly queer character. He's meant to be representative of Lou Reed and Iggy Pop, who's very extreme and just kind of extreme in a violent way, sort of this pro before hard metal rock punk type of person. He was sort of that figure that punk was based off of. And then finally, at the very end, the jewel ends up with Arthur, so with the journalist. So I wanted to know if anyone had any thoughts about what this jewel was meant to symbolize. So I read, I did a little bit of reading because I have watched this film many times and I've just never really have gotten the link with Oscar Wilde or what this jewel was meant to be. And so I was really focusing on it this time. And I read somewhere that someone had compared it to the rosebud in Citizen Kane. So obviously the story follows very similarly to Citizen Kane. It's set up the same way and the narrative is told the same way. So it's sort of related to this, what everyone's seeking after is this rosebud. What is rosebud in Citizen Kane? So it's sort of the same idea as what is this jewel? What could it be representative of? Does anyone have any thoughts on it? I know it's a very obscure thing and there probably isn't an answer to it, but.
Well, I was thinking that obviously Oscar Wilde is a huge queer literary icon. And so I wasn't sure if there was some sort of connection between kind of the queerness of all of these characters, but also in performance, because obviously Oscar Wilde's most famous novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, it's all about vanity and image and performance and keeping young. And so in the novel, in case anyone doesn't know, Dorian Gray is obsessed with being forever young and being beautiful. And so he makes this deal where he has this portrait of himself and the portrait ends up aging instead of him, but he can't kind of look at it and stuff. And it's kind of, this idea of having different shells and being a different person and putting on characters and putting on performance, which obviously links in with David Bowie so well, because we all know that kind of David Bowie himself was a fictionalized character created by David Jones, and he never had a authentic presence as such. He was very big on performance, as well as obviously being a queer icon. So that's the connection I made there.
Yeah, I think that's really good because I haven't read any of Oscar Wilde's stuff. So I just knew that he was a queer icon. So that's actually a really interesting link. And it probably is mostly what it's compared to. I also kind of thought that it would this is kind of stupid now because your idea was so good, Sarah. I was like, maybe it gives you like the power to be a cultural icon. Like this jewel is like, because there is a lot of imagery of like aliens in this movie. Like there's just like this random like spacecraft that shows up. And like obviously the connection there is because David Bowie was, you know, a spaceman. But, you know, it's sort of this, I kind of saw it as like this supernatural element that like whoever has it has the power over culture and society, and they have this like particularly with queerness because so when Brian Slade gets it, he becomes this big powerful queer icon and this big pop star. Jack Ferry was obviously the person who was this big queer icon before Brian Slade took his jewel from him, and then at the very end Arthur gets it, and I kind of saw it as this Arthur is now the owner of this jewel, so he's going to go on and become this really, like Oscar Wilde, become this queer writer and this queer icon because obviously he's coming out, his part of his narrative of the story, the purpose of him being in the story is that he identified with queerness and became to understand his sexuality because of these glam rock stars.
Yeah, that was kind of my favorite part of that film. I really love I love also, as I said, I love how both of the films are quite explicit in their sexuality and their queerness, both Rocketman and Velvet Goldmine. But what I love about Velvet Goldmine so much, like one of the first scenes is just people talking about being bisexual, which is just so unusual, even these days, whether that's in like contemporary television, films, or, you know, books. People are often represented as either lesbian or gay, but you don't always have the representation for bisexuality, which is just so important. So I really loved that. It was, yeah, just these like, you know, young people being like, oh yeah, like everyone's bisexual these days, and which is really fun. And obviously then the journalist has this kind of realization of his queerness through glam rock and through queer icons in music, which is really nice. And that all of the scenes are quite explicit, which is yeah, it was quite fun to see because there's nothing left. It's not like they're just implying like, oh, like maybe he's queer and maybe he's kind of fancies David Bowie. It's very like, you know, it's said on a tin, which is really unusual, and I really love that.
One of my favorite scenes is when Brian Slade's doing a press conference, which is obviously very reminiscent of David Bowie doing his press conferences and saying, yeah, I'm gay, like what about it, you know? And so it's this press conference of Brian Slade's on the TV, and Arthur is obviously still a teenager, and he's watching this press conference with his parents, who are very conservative figures, you know, are very much this sort of representation of this post-war older generation who just didn't understand sexuality and were still very conservative. And there's this great moment of Arthur just going up to the TV and saying, this is me, this is me, this is exactly who I am. And then we see that it's a vision that he wants to have of being able to tell his parents. And because he sees that in Brian Slade, with Brian Slade just saying, yeah, I'm bisexual, I'm married, but you know, I have an open marriage with my wife and we're both perfectly fine with that. And so he's just like, you know, I'm gay too. And that's, I think, one of the really most powerful moments of the film is you just see that imagery of him jumping up and down saying, yes, this is who I am. This is how I identify as a person.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And obviously because it's so focused on music and art and performance, I really love kind of this message it sends of like how art is so, it creates a safe space for people to like find themselves and meet like-minded people. And it's just, yeah, such a beautiful message.
I think discussing the jewel as kind of a symbol of queerness almost, I think it's important to note that like at the end Arthur receives it, he gets given it by Kurt Wilde, who earlier in the film we see he had like years before had I think it was a one-night stand with, and from what we've seen that was his kind of first, and as I mean I could be wrong, but that was like his first and maybe only kind of exposure to queerness. And initially when being, or like his sexuality, and initially after being given the jewel he rejects it, and then Kurt kind of like sneaks it back to him, and I kind of view that as a like a, at this point he can't deny it anymore. He's met Kurt again after all these years, and it's like brought up all of the things that he's kind of repressed and been thinking about, and the whole movie, the whole trip he's gone on, the whole adventure, was kind of a roundabout way of him discovering himself, and him receiving the jewel at the end is kind of the final acceptance of that moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the very beginning, he's really hesitant to take on this article because he doesn't want to have to, return to that era of, if he is, still pretending to be straight, when he returns back to these people, and these characters obviously were a big influence on him trying to understand his sexuality. And so obviously opening up those doors again was something that he didn't want to do, but hopefully, we can look at it as a positive ending, and it, now has given him the ability to be more open in his identity. So I think with particularly if we talk about the rock stars themselves, so we have been really talking about Elton and David Bowie. What kind of perspectives of the stars do we get in these films? So we talked about Elton being actually the real Elton John being involved in the production and the influence of how this movie was going to be made. With David Bowie, he had actually was in the process of suing Velvet Goldmine, the production, because the story was too close to his own biography and his own own appearance as Ziggy Stardust. And David Bowie was very much a person who didn't want, he still to this day, his family and his estate will not authorize an official biopic. So there was a biopic that came out last year that was actually like really David Bowie biopic that was it was like Bohemian Rhapsody, but it wasn't allowed to use any of his music. And they completely, anything that was copyrighted for David Bowie wasn't allowed to be used, and his family was very against this movie being made. So I guess sort of the idea then would be, how are the sort of the fictional narratives that are projected in these stories, how do they impact our understanding of these characters and these rock performers? That might be a very abstract idea, because so for anyone who doesn't know, this is my area of research. So I did my master's thesis on David Bowie as a character actor. So this is something that I'm really interested in, and particularly the idea of the myth of the man versus his reality. So Rocketman obviously uses a lot of magical realism to tell the truth about Elton, which we see when we were, talking about the costuming and that pool scene in particular. It's very magical, but it's meant to be a metaphor for how Elton relates to the world around him. Whereas Velvet Goldmine really enhances this myth of Bowie as this mythical being. And I think you get that a lot with the space imagery in the film, and sort of particularly what I love about Velvet Goldmine is that it's focused more on the culture and how how particularly this David Bowie figure influenced generations of queer people, generations of musicians, generations, to come of creatives, and how, his biography is never actually explored in this movie, but it's very much an ode to him as a person.
I would say with Rocketman, it really, so the narrative and the way it's made doesn't shy away, like from what Will said earlier. He's not made an icon in the film. He comes across terribly.
Yeah.
And I've read Elton's autobiography, and he's so self-aware that he was a horrible person for a lot of his, like the height of his fame. He was a victim of hubris, and I think the film you see through the costume design, you see through how elaborate the lifestyle he leads, that he becomes vicious and nasty and jaded, and the film doesn't shy away from that. The people around him struggle, and there's that sequence, the sorry seems to be the hardest word scene, where he's singing, and it suddenly dawns on him that he's the issue, and that his success and his treatment of people is why his life is the way it is. And I think that's a really it's a heavy way of showing this icon. I feel for a lot of people, myself included, I was like, oh, so this is what he was like. It doesn't shy away from that. It kind of embraces it.
Yeah,
I think
Oh, go ahead.
I've lost it now.
Oh, sorry. I've been talking too much. But I was going to say, while you think about what you were going to say, Alex, when I was watching it this time in particular, I don't know how much I was thinking about this the first time I watched it, but I'm like, my relationship with Elton John as a millennial, as someone who grew up in the 2000s, my relationship with him is always as an old man. Like, he's always been sort of the man who does the musicals, right? So he did The Lion King, and then he did Billy Elliot. I was really influenced by Billy Elliot when I was little. That was one of my favorite musicals when I was like about in my early teens. So I know Elton John as this very like nice old man who makes musicals and is just living his best life. So I think it was just such a crazy thing to like watch this and be like, that's not the Elton John I know, but then an older generation who actually grew up with Elton would be like, yeah, absolutely, he was this terrible person. He was this, way over the top, horrible, narcissistic asshole. But I think with David Bowie in particular, I hadn't come to David Bowie as like an actual performer, or like a person as an icon, until about 2018. So when I started my master's, and that's the first time I really got into David Bowie as like a performer, him as a musician, whatever. But I think what is so interesting about Bowie is that he's always been a part of this like cultural psyche, and you always recognize him as, you see that image of him as Ziggy Stardust or Aladdin Sane, if we're being technical, but I'm a researcher, so I gotta be technical, of him, that cover of him as Aladdin Sane with, that where he's really painted white and he has that teardrop coming off his collarbone. And that's just such an iconic image in culture that you sort of more associate David Bowie with Ziggy Stardust and this sort of image of him as Ziggy Stardust than him as an older man. And I was sort of thinking about this today, particularly in the 2000s. So for about 10 years, from 2000 to 2003 to 2013, he didn't do any public appearances. So he never appeared in public. So that was sort of more of his like prime, older man age. And you didn't really see him that much until he came back in 2013. So you really don't get to have this image of him as being an older man, because his most iconic imagery is him as a young man, as Ziggy Stardust. And that obviously is so easy to identify in Velvet Goldmine because the imagery looks exactly like Ziggy Stardust. So it's easy to see that relationship. It's very easy to connect that relationship with David Bowie without actually having David Bowie mentioned at all in the story. Sorry, that was a massive tangent.
I feel like it's so hard to think about how you'd perceive these stars before the film or after the film, because it's such a personal thing. Like, for example, for me, I was a huge David Bowie fan for a really long time, and David Bowie was really kind of a key kind of figure in the kind of people I listened to and stuff when I was kind of discovering my sexuality. And it was a huge part in my life when I went to Berlin, kind of discovering my sexuality and spending time with like a lot of more queer people and stuff. And I went to see his exhibition at V&A there. And also at the time I knew I wanted to study film. So being at the exhibition and seeing these costumes and all of the kind of, you can see the little queer stuff peppered throughout the exhibition, as well as all of the influences from film that he's taken. So to me, David Bowie's incredibly personal, and what I see David Bowie as is something that I project onto him, and something that I have like experience with. Whereas with Elton John, I was really surprised. I told my boyfriend this after we finished watching the film. I was like, I didn't know anything about Elton John, and I thought I knew because I heard his name around a lot and I knew some of his songs. So I had this idea in my head that I knew who Elton John was because he was so famous, but I didn't know anything at all really, apart from the fact that he was queer. So yeah, it was really interesting to then go and discover that afterwards, being older, and so my experiences of the two stars are, you know, me having my personal experience with David Bowie in my teens, when I was discovering my sexuality, and now as kind of like, you know, mid-20s, very comfortable with myself, trying to find out more about Elton John. So it's quite nice to see how we take celebrities and how we kind of make their experiences our own.
And I think and I think that's what's so, in my opinion, what's so great about Velvet Goldmine is it's about the idea of the icon more than it is the icon himself. And that's what I think is so great about it, because it really explores how influential celebrities, and in particular David Bowie and these glam rock stars, were on the teens of this generation that they're talking about. So
I think for me, one of the most important parts of these films is that, as we said earlier, with Rocketman, we know Elton isn't a reliable narrator, and in Velvet, I've forgotten the second one, Velvet Goldmine. It's not, I mean, it is about Bowie, but it's not about Bowie, you know, because of complications. And so what I like is that they do show these people's lives, but they're not there saying this is exactly how it was. They're very clear that this is an interpretation, and with anything that is turned into any form of art, things are bridged over, changed, remembered differently to how they actually happened. And with Elton, I don't have much of an opinion about him. I really enjoy his music, but I don't know much about him. But what I do feel after watching the film is a degree of respect that he was so aware of himself and so open to showing the bad bits of him, because I think a lot of people struggle to be honest about the reality of their own lives and how they've treated other people. So I do respect that Elton was able to step back and go, you know what, I wasn't a good guy, we'll share this, we're not going to paint this picture that I was this great, lovely star that everyone should appreciate.
Like Bohemian Rhapsody did.
Yeah.
All right, does anyone have any final thoughts before we wrap this up? No? All right, so my final thoughts are everyone should go watch both of these movies because they're very brilliant. I would personally recommend double billing them, so watching them back to back. Velvet Goldmine is very much more underground, more of a cult favorite, a cult classic. So, you know, I think that one is worthy of a late night viewing. It's, you know, just has that vibe, really gets you into the mood. And then obviously with Rocketman, you're going to want to sing along. So put the captions on so you can sing along with it. Hopefully you have enjoyed our slightly unhinged but very passionate discussion today. Film East provides the opportunity for young people to engage with cinema in a variety of ways. So do get in touch with us if you're interested in contributing to either our film and television blog or becoming a more active member in the group. In addition to this podcast, we also curated a collection of films for this year's festival that center around the theme of immigration and migration. The digital program includes 16 films split up into 4 different strands, focusing on the different aspects of the modern migrant experience. All of the films are available to watch online, allowing you to extend the themes of this year's festival beyond its physical dates. Check out youngnorfolkarts.org.uk to download the program. To learn more about Film East and the Young Film Programmers, visit our website, film-east.com, or follow us on any of our social media, @films_east. Again, we're Film East, a Norwich-based young film programmers group supported by Reel Connections. Thanks for listening.